On January 7, 1776, the last cannon in a line of loaded sledges moved onto the ice of the Hudson River at Albany. The crews had already brought the other pieces across. They had worked cautiously, spreading the weight and watching the surface beneath the runners. Then, the final gun broke through. Iron, timber, and rigging dropped into the freezing water. The accident was serious, but it was not the end of the expedition. By the following night, with help from people in Albany, the men had recovered the cannon and moved 23 sledges safely across the river. Their leader, Henry Knox, was 25 years old. Only a few years earlier, he had been selling books in Boston. Now he was responsible for nearly 60 tons of captured artillery on a winter journey of roughly 300 miles. That contrast has made Knox's expedition one of the most celebrated logistical stories of the American Revolution. It has also allowed legend to overtake evidence. The real achievement was not a superhuman struggle against endless snow or one man's refusal to abandon a single gun. It was a complicated operation in which cold could help as much as it hurt. Horses often replaced the oxen shown in later paintings, local committees supplied essential labor, and several dangerous crossings depended on luck. The central question is not simply how Knox endured the winter. It is how a young officer assembled enough people, transport, information, and favorable weather to convert captured weapons into military pressure outside Boston, and what that pressure actually changed. In the autumn of 1775, the Continental Army had surrounded Boston but could not close the harbor. British troops occupied the town, and the Royal Navy maintained access to the sea. George Washington's forces controlled the land approaches, yet they lacked the heavy artillery needed to threaten British positions and shipping. The result was a siege without a clear mechanism for ending it. Time created another danger. Many American enlistments expired near the end of the year. Washington feared that his army might shrink just as the British strengthened their defenses or received reinforcements. Gunpowder had also been dangerously scarce. Courage alone could not solve either problem. To make the British position in Boston genuinely vulnerable, the Continental Army needed heavier guns, and the organization required already existed. In May 1775, American forces led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had seized Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. Crown Point fell soon afterward. The captured forts contained cannon, mortars, howitzers, lead, and other military stores. The problem was geography. The weapons were in northern New York. Washington's army was outside Boston, separated from them by lakes, rivers, rough roads, and the Berkshire uplands. The weapons had not been forgotten. Arnold had begun recording the captured ordnance and had argued for its military value. But the Northern Theater demanded men, boats, and supplies of its own as American forces pushed toward Canada. No single command structure could casually strip the forts and send everything south. Washington needed a representative who could identify what Boston required without crippling other operations. Knox's orders therefore emphasized selection as well as movement. He was not to empty a storehouse blindly. He was to choose a useful artillery train and send it through a region where civil and military authorities shared responsibility. The idea of moving artillery from the Lake Champlain forts did not belong to Knox alone. American leaders had discussed retrieving weapons from New York, and Arnold had recognized their value months earlier. What distinguished Knox was that Washington selected him to carry the plan through. On November 16th, the commander ordered him to obtain the cannon and authorized him to spend up to £1,000 on the mission. Washington also instructed Major General Philip Schuyler in New York to assist him. Knox was an unusual choice, but not an irrational one. Born in Boston in 1750, he left school young after his family lost its principal support. His father, a shipmaster, had disappeared at sea and was presumed dead. Knox went to work in the book trade, first as an employee and later as the proprietor of his own London bookstore. He was outgoing, physically imposing, and intensely curious. Books gave him access to subjects that formal schooling had not. Military science became one of those subjects. Knox read works on artillery, fortification, and engineering. He also joined Boston's Grenadier Corps, which gave him some practical experience beyond the printed page. His knowledge was not equivalent to a long professional career in a European artillery service, but it was far more than casual enthusiasm. By the time fighting began, he could connect technical study with the immediate problems of field defenses and gun positions. His political and personal worlds were less simple. Knox married Lucy Flucker in June 1774. Her father, Thomas Flucker, was the Royal Secretary of Massachusetts, and her family remained loyal to the Crown. The marriage placed Lucy between her parents and a husband, moving steadily toward the Patriot cause. When the war divided Boston, that tension became permanent. Her parents eventually left for England, and she never saw them again. After Lexington and Concord, Henry and Lucy escaped from British-held Boston. A later family tradition says that Lucy concealed Henry's sword beneath her clothing. The precise detail is difficult to prove, but their departure is not. Knox joined the American forces outside the town, helped with fortifications, and impressed senior officers with his energy and technical confidence. Washington soon treated him as an experienced engineer and supported his appointment as colonel of the Continental Artillery. The mission to New York therefore became more than a transport assignment. It was a test of whether Knox could turn theoretical and practical knowledge into an operation spread across several jurisdictions. He would have to inspect the weapons, choose which ones mattered, find boats and sledges, hire crews, negotiate prices, coordinate with military officers and civilian committees, and keep the whole movement synchronized with unpredictable weather. Knox left the Cambridge area on November 17th. He traveled first through New York City, where he sought supplies and help from local authorities, then continued north through Albany. He met Schuyler on December 1st and reached Fort Ticonderoga on December 5th. His younger brother William accompanied him and would take an important role in moving the artillery south. At Ticonderoga and Crown Point, Knox selected 59 pieces. The inventory included iron and brass cannon, mortars, howitzers, and smaller coehorn mortars. Together they weighed nearly 120,000 pounds. He also took 23 boxes of lead, each weighing 100 pounds, and a barrel of musket flints. The collection was not merely large, it was irregular. Guns of different types and sizes required different handling, different carriages, and eventually different ammunition and tactical uses. That variety mattered. Long cannon fired on relatively flat trajectories and could batter fortifications or threaten ships. Mortars threw explosive shells on high arcs. Howitzers occupied a useful middle ground. Small coehorns were more portable, while the largest cannon demanded extraordinary transport. Brass pieces were generally more valuable and lighter than iron guns of comparable size, but every weapon still depended on serviceable vents, appropriate shot, powder, implements, and trained gunners. Knox was transporting a collection of capabilities, not 59 interchangeable tubes. 12 iron 18-pounders were among the heaviest pieces. The designation described the weight of the solid shot, not the weight of the cannon itself. A long gun could weigh several thousand pounds before anyone added a sledge, ropes, tools, or supplies. Moving one demanded a strong platform and a reliable team. Moving 59 weapons and their stores demanded a transport system. The first movement was by water. Knox's crews spent 3 days loading the ordnance onto a collection of vessels, including flat-bottomed boats suited to the lakes and rivers of the region. The boats departed on December 9th for the southern end of Lake George. Knox went ahead to Fort George, where he began arranging the land transport. The passage on Lake George revealed how quickly the operation could fail. One heavily loaded boat grounded and later foundered near Sabbath Day Point. The vessel did not vanish into deep water. Enough of it remained above the surface for William Knox and the crew to bail it out and refloat it. The cargo continued south. Even so, the delay exposed the vulnerability of the entire plan. Before the cannon could be hauled toward Boston, they first had to survive a difficult lake passage in early winter. At Fort George, Knox confronted a second problem. Roads that were deeply rutted or soft could not carry the heaviest guns on wheeled vehicles. Frozen ground and snow were not simply enemies. They were infrastructure. Packed snow allowed wooden runners to slide over roads that would otherwise stop the convoy. In a report to Washington, Knox wrote that without good sledding, the guns could not move at all. This fact reverses the usual image of the expedition. Severe cold threatened men and animals, and unstable ice threatened the cannon, yet mild weather could be equally damaging. Too little snow exposed rough ground. A thaw softened the roads and weakened river crossings. The mission depended on a narrow range of winter conditions: enough snow for the sledges, enough cold for the ice, but not so much snowfall that teams became exhausted breaking an untraveled path. Knox initially asked a local committee for 40 strong sledges, capable of carrying the long cannon without letting their barrels drag. By December 17th, he reported that 42 exceptionally strong sledges had been built and that 80 yoke of oxen had been arranged as far as Springfield. That letter supplied the phrase by which the expedition would be remembered. If the weather cooperated, Knox hoped to present Washington with a noble train of artillery. His estimate was optimistic. The necessary snow had not yet covered the entire route, and the animals actually available did not always match his plan. Surviving records show that horses pulled much of the train from Fort George toward Albany, despite the ox teams that dominate later artwork. Oxen were familiar heavy haulers, but owners and teamsters negotiated over prices, distance, and the risk to their animals. Knox could request a particular form of transport. He could not command an unlimited supply. The operation was therefore assembled in sections. Local men provided sledges and teams for one part of the route, while other crews would have to be found farther south and east. Committees received requests for food, shelter, ropes, and transport. Schuyler used his knowledge of New York and his administrative network to locate teams. William Knox supervised the guns while Henry moved ahead, solving the next problem before the convoy reached it. Christmas brought heavy snow. For the artillery sledges, it promised better movement. For Knox traveling alone toward Albany, it created a different ordeal. On December 26, his horses became exhausted after only a short distance. He continued on foot through snow that he described as 3 feet deep, reached a house where he was given food and fresh horses, and finally arrived in Albany. His diary records that he had nearly perished from the cold. That entry is valuable because it keeps the danger at human scale. Knox did not need an invented avalanche, a runaway cannon on every mountain, or a dramatic speech to prove the journey was difficult. He was moving through a rural winter landscape in which roads could disappear, animals could refuse to continue, and the next reliable team might depend on the hospitality of a stranger. In Albany, Knox and Schuyler spent several days sending men and teams north. Sledges were loaded as they became available and began moving from Fort George. Then the weather changed again. Snow covered the roads, but the Hudson River had not frozen deeply enough to bear the heaviest loads. The route required repeated crossings of waterways near the Hudson and Mohawk. Knox wrote to Washington that a thaw was preventing the train from crossing the Hudson, which the movement from Lake George to Albany required several times. His men even poured water onto existing ice, hoping the added layer would freeze and strengthen the surface. It was a practical experiment born of urgency, not proof that the river had become safe. On January 4th, a brass 24-pounder and a small mortar arrived in Albany. More guns followed. Then Knox received alarming news that one of the heaviest cannon had fallen through the ice near Half Moon. He redirected other loads toward a crossing he believed was stronger. The train continued, but the danger shifted south with it. On January 7th, at the crossing from Albany toward the eastern bank, the last cannon again broke through. Knox had taken precautions, but the ice failed anyway. The next day, the gun was recovered, and local resident helped the crews get the sledges across. The episode reveals the expedition's real pattern. Knox planned carefully. Conditions defeated parts of the plan. He adjusted the route, found assistance, recovered equipment, and continued. It also warns against treating every familiar illustration as literal evidence. Later images often show one continuous column of ox-drawn sledges crossing a white wilderness under Knox's direct gaze. The historical movement was more fragmented. Loads traveled at different speeds. Horses were common. Knox sometimes rode ahead of the guns. Crews changed. The convoy expanded and contracted as local resources entered or left the operation. Fragmentation did mean disorder. It allowed the expedition to use roads and crossings without concentrating the full weight in one place. It also reduced the chance that one broken sledge would immobilize every gun. The cost was a harder command problem. Knox had to know which loads had arrived, which had crossed, which still needed teams, and where fresh animals could be obtained. Letters moved more slowly than riders, and plans made in Albany could be overtaken by a thaw before they reached Fort George. The train advanced because information moved ahead of it. By noon on January 9th, with the artillery moving east from Albany, Knox rode ahead toward Kinderhook and Claverack. From this point, the documentary record becomes thinner. His diary contains fewer details, and part of the precise route through New York and Massachusetts remains uncertain. Modern trail markers preserve a plausible reconstruction, not a complete day-by-day map supported by uninterrupted testimony. That uncertainty matters because some of the expedition's most dramatic stories appear in later retellings rather than in Knox's surviving record. Tales of cannon plunging into ravines, teamsters pinned beneath overturned sledges, or crews lowering every heavy piece down mountain slopes with chains may sound possible. The Berkshire roads were difficult, and heavy loads on steep grades were undeniably dangerous. But possibility is not documentation. The strongest account does not need to convert every mile into a separate catastrophe. What can be said with confidence is impressive enough. The train moved southeast through the Hudson Valley and into the Berkshire region. Snow conditions varied. At Blandford, a crew resisted continuing, concerned about the route and the lack of good sledding. Knox secured additional animals and persuaded the movement to continue. At Springfield, new crews had to replace New York teamsters who wanted to return home. Each transfer risked delay. A teamster knew his own animals and local roads. A replacement crew inherited a load that might weigh several thousand pounds and rigging it had not prepared. Harness, runners, and fastening ropes required inspection. Food and shelter had to be arranged for people and animals. A single broken component might stop one gun, while the rest of the train stretched farther down the road. This is where Knox's bookseller background becomes relevant without turning into a fable about natural genius. Running a shop had required credit, inventory, correspondence, customer relationships, and judgment about suppliers. Artillery study gave him technical language. Militia service gave him practical familiarity. The expedition demanded all of those skills at once, combined with the authority of Washington's orders and the support of Schuyler, local committees, farmers, craftsmen, and hired drivers. The journey was not a solitary act of will. It was a temporary network. Washington defined the strategic need. Knox organized the movement. Schuyler mobilized resources in New York. William Knox supervised part of the convoy. Teamsters controlled the animals. Local residents opened routes, provided meals and lodging, assisted at river crossings, and supplied replacement teams. The noble train existed only because those contributions could be joined at the correct moment. By late January, the artillery reached eastern Massachusetts. John Adams saw the train pass through Framingham on January 25th. The guns arrived in the Cambridge area in separate groups around the end of the month. From Knox's departure in November to the final deliveries, the mission had taken about 10 weeks. The most concentrated movement of the loaded train from Fort George to the Boston lines occupied a much shorter part of that period, but delays and preparation were as real as miles traveled. The arrival was therefore not one triumphant parade. It was the completion of a moving schedule whose separate loads finally converged on the army that needed them. The 59 pieces did not all roll directly onto a battlefield ready to fire. Some lacked carriages and implements. Artillery requires more than a barrel. Guns needed suitable mounts, ammunition, powder, tools, trained crews, and positions from which they could be used. Knox's larger assignment was to help transform the Continental artillery from a scattered collection into a functioning arm of Washington's army. Winter transport had solved only the first half of the problem. A siege gun needed a carriage strong enough to absorb recoil and wheels suited to its position. Powder charges had to match the weapon. Shot had to fit the bore closely enough to be effective without becoming unsafe. Crews needed drills for loading, aiming, firing, sponging, and clearing the piece. Repairmen and laborers had to maintain platforms and move ammunition. The weeks between arrival and the Dorchester operation gave Knox's regiment time to integrate at least part of the captured ordnance into this larger system. The captured weapons nevertheless changed the options available at Boston. Heavy cannon strengthened existing batteries and made a more ambitious operation possible. The crucial ground lay on the Dorchester Peninsula south of the town. Its heights overlooked Boston and the harbor approaches. If the Americans fortified those elevations and installed artillery, British commanders would face a more dangerous position. But even here, the familiar story requires correction. Washington did not instantly place all of Knox's guns on Dorchester Heights and force a surprised enemy to flee. The operation emerged from months of debate, engineering, and preparation. Other officers contributed essential ideas. Major General Artemus Ward had long emphasized the value of Dorchester. Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Putnam helped devise a method for fortifying the heights quickly. General John Thomas would lead the troops who occupied them. The ground posed a tactical problem. Dorchester Heights consisted of commanding elevations on a peninsula connected to the mainland by a low, exposed neck. American troops moving onto the hills could be attacked before they completed strong defenses. Frozen soil would slow conventional digging. The British had already demonstrated at Bunker Hill that they were willing to assault newly fortified high ground, even at terrible cost. Putnam found a practical answer in a military engineering text. Wooden frames called chandeliers could support bundles of sticks known as fascines, creating immediate protection while soldiers dug and strengthened the works. Carpenters prepared these frames in advance. Hundreds of carts carried fascines, hay, tools, and other materials toward the peninsula. The solution was an act of logistics and engineering closely related to Knox's expedition. Materials had to arrive in the right sequence before the enemy could react. Washington initially favored a direct attack across the frozen harbor. In February, a council of war rejected that proposal and supported taking Dorchester Heights instead. By late February, preparations accelerated. The army collected entrenching tools, assigned units, and planned diversionary bombardments. The date carried symbolic weight. The movement was scheduled for the night of March 4th, with the British expected to respond on March 5th, the anniversary of the Boston Massacre. American batteries opened a bombardment to distract the British. Then, at about 8 in the evening, the first troops reached the Dorchester Peninsula. Roughly 800 men formed a covering force. About 1,200 laborers under Thomas moved toward the Twin Hills. More than 300 carts transported construction materials. Drivers guided their teams quietly, and hay was positioned to screen movement across exposed ground. Artillery went with the column, but surviving accounts do not support the image of all 59 Ticonderoga weapons crowding the crest. One artillerist recorded 6 12-pounders and 6 or 8 field pieces. Some may have come from the captured collection. Other guns and ammunition were distributed elsewhere around the siege lines. What mattered was that Knox's mission had enlarged the Army's overall artillery capacity enough to support the plan. By 10 o'clock, the first defensive frames and fascines provided protection against small arms and grapeshot. Soldiers then began strengthening the works with earth. Fresh troops arrived before dawn. The operation was not literally silent, nor did a complete stone fortress rise in a few hours. It was something more credible and militarily useful. A carefully prepared field position became defensible before the British could organize an immediate assault. When the haze lifted after sunrise on March 5th, General William Howe saw extensive works where there had been none the day before. He understood the threat. American artillery on the peninsula endangered both Boston and the fleet. British guns attempted to disrupt the position, but their fire had limited effect. Howe ordered preparations for an attack. Washington had anticipated that response. American units stood ready at their alarm posts, and plans included a possible assault on Boston if the British committed heavily against Dorchester. The situation could still have produced a bloody battle. The Continental position was new, the British were experienced, and neither side could know with certainty how the defenses would perform under a determined attack. Weather intervened. A violent storm on March 5th and 6th prevented the British movement. By the time conditions improved, the Americans had strengthened their works. An assault now promised greater cost with less chance of success. The tactical window had closed. The guns on the heights did not suddenly place every ship under certain destruction. Artillery accuracy, ammunition, range, and elevation imposed limits. Yet the position increased the danger to the fleet and narrowed Howe's choices. Remaining in Boston no longer offered an acceptable balance of risk and value. British plans also extended beyond Boston. Senior officers had considered leaving the town before the Dorchester operation, and New York was becoming the more important strategic objective. Orders, transatlantic communication, shipping, weather, and preparations for withdrawal had delayed a departure. Dorchester Heights did not invent the idea of evacuation. It made delay more dangerous and helped force the decision to act. Over the following days, British troops pulled back into Boston and prepared to embark. Residents feared that the town might be destroyed if the withdrawal were attacked. A message from Boston's selectmen communicated Howe's warning that he did not intend to burn the town unless his troops were molested during departure. The Americans allowed the evacuation to proceed. On March 17th, British soldiers, dependents and loyalist civilians boarded the fleet and sailed for Halifax. Estimates vary, but the departure involved thousands of troops and more than 1,000 civilians. It was a military withdrawal and a personal catastrophe for families who believed they could not safely remain. Boston passed from British control without the direct assault Washington had once contemplated. Continental forces entered the town after the fleet departed. The siege was over. For the new army, the result was an important strategic success. It secured Boston, removed a British garrison from Massachusetts, and demonstrated that coordinated military pressure could produce a major result. It also showed the value of engineering, artillery, preparation, and civilian cooperation in a war, often remembered mainly through battlefield charges. The victory did not prove that British power had been broken. Howe's army remained intact and would return against New York with overwhelming naval support. The evacuation did not single-handedly persuade Congress to declare independence, and Knox's cannon did not make American victory inevitable. The war would continue for more than 7 years through severe defeats, internal conflict, foreign intervention, and enormous human loss. What the expedition changed was narrower and more concrete. It gave Washington additional heavy weapons at a moment when his army had few. Those weapons supported the bombardment and occupation of Dorchester Heights. The heights accelerated the British departure and reduced the chance that the siege would continue into spring. The result released Continental forces for other campaigns and offered a visible success at a time when the revolutionary cause badly needed one. For Knox, the mission established a reputation that shaped the rest of his career. He became Chief of Artillery and remained one of Washington's trusted officers at Trenton, Princeton, Monmouth, and Yorktown. He helped coordinate guns, whose movement and concentration could decide what infantry alone could not. His strength was not simply that he had read about artillery. It was that he understood artillery as a system of weapons, crews, transport, supply, terrain, and command. After the war, Knox served as Secretary at War under the Confederation, and then became first Secretary of War under the Constitution. He dealt with the difficult problem of building military institutions in a republic suspicious of standing armies. He supported professional military education and a stronger national defense. Though the United States Military Academy would not be established until 1802, years after he left office, Knox retired to Maine in 1795 and died in 1806. His later years included financial difficulty and disappointed ambitions as well as public honor. Reducing his life to a simple ascent from bookstore to national greatness hides those complications. It also misses the deeper lesson of his best-known achievement. The noble train of artillery succeeded because expertise was distributed across a network. Knox supplied energy, technical understanding, and coordination. Others supplied authority, labor, animals, local knowledge, money, shelter, and time. Winter supplied the sliding surface the guns required, then threatened to destroy them when ice weakened or snow became too deep. No part of that system was fully under one man's control. That is why the cannon falling through the Hudson is a better symbol than any invented speech on a mountain pass. The plan did not unfold perfectly. It failed in small, dangerous ways. A route proved unsafe. A team became exhausted. A river opened beneath a load. Each failure demanded another decision and another group of people willing to help. Nearly 60 tons of artillery reached the army outside Boston, not because the obstacles disappeared, and not because one heroic figure physically conquered 300 miles of wilderness. The guns arrived because Knox kept reorganizing the movement around conditions as they actually were. Weeks later, the same principle shaped Dorchester Heights. Prefabricated defenses compensated for frozen ground, carts concentrated materials before dawn, artillery covered labor, and weather denied the British time to respond. The expedition's real legacy is therefore not a claim that a bookseller single-handedly saved a revolution. It is evidence that logistics can create strategy. The cannon were powerless while they sat at Ticonderoga. Transport made them available, organization made them usable, position made them threatening, and at Boston, that chain of decisions helped turn captured iron into a result no isolated act of bravery could have produced.